Good morning. Welcome to Ray's Reflection, the Common Man's Bible Study. Today we're going to start chapter 6 of John. And before we start, let me give you some background to prepare you. First of all, the chapter 6 of John is an extremely important chapter in the teaching and presenting of Jesus Christ as the bread of life. We must never forget the reason John wrote this gospel. If we do, it will color the way in which we interpret the scriptures. If we forget it, we will tend to allegorize it. We will tend to put in things, or what we call eisegete, instead of exegete. Instead of taking out of scripture what is there, we will start putting into scripture, and we will use scripture to fit some of our scenarios. Example, walking on water, we'll talk about a storm in life coming up and how Jesus is there in that storm of life. And that's not this picture. It's not the reason John gave this. Let me read to you the reason John gave this. He says in chapter 20 of verse 31 of this book, he says this: "But these are written," and he's talking about the miracles that Jesus has performed, "that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you might have life through his name." So therefore, the reason John wrote this gospel is so that we would believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. Therefore, when you look at chapter 6 and you look at the things in chapter 6, you must look at them as Jesus presenting himself as the Son of God. Now, he does it in two ways. He does it through illustration. He performs a miracle. Then he teaches or preaches a message concerning or related to that miracle. And therefore we will see this. And we always need to keep that in mind, that this gospel was written to prove that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, to convince all readers that Jesus was the Son of God. So let us start, and I'll begin in verse 1 of chapter 6, and we'll explain things as we go along. It says, "After these things," in other words, after the events in Jerusalem. And I do believe that chapter 6 is probably the highlight of Jesus' ministry. He said, after these things, after his confrontation with the Sanhedrin, etc., Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee. And let's take a look at the Sea of Galilee here. You will see, if you look, you will see different things here, but we're looking here mostly in this area here and in this area here. These are all Jewish names, so you're going to have a difficult time reading them. So I decided to give you a different map, and here's the map here. We're going to be dealing with the area of Tiberias here and Capernaum here. Now this is where he made his home base, up here in Capernaum. I have been here. This is where the feeding of the 5,000 took place. Here, I have been where everyone claims that this took place. And let me give you a little background what I saw. It's a mountain. It goes up and up and up and up and up, but it's a slope. It's not jagged and crooked, etc. It's a slope that just goes up, and it seems to go up forever. And it's grassy. It's a very grassy slope all the way down. And one of the things, as I was studying the scriptures and I was reading where Jesus had humongous followers, and here in this particular case we have 5,000 males. That means you probably have their wives, and we probably have children, so we're talking maybe 15 to 20,000 people. And I thought to myself all this time, how is it possible for one man to stand and speak and for 20,000 people to hear him, and he doesn't have the modern technology of today? He doesn't have the amps, he doesn't have the mics, he doesn't have all these things that we have today. So in my infantile or my young, immature mind, I thought, well, he's God. He can make everybody hear. And I dismissed it as that until I went to this place. And I saw this slope. It's a slope. It's a mountain. And it just slopes down, and it's covered with grass. It slopes all the way down to the sea. And right in the middle of it, there is an indentation in that hill. in that mountain. There's an indentation, and it looks very much like a concert where a person, an alcove of some kind, where a person can sit and the echo, and he speaks and everybody can hear. And to this day, a person can stand in that alcove, in that indentured area, and speak normally, etc., and people will hear him for huge distances. And I think this is where Jesus stood. And when he spoke to the 20,000, 15,000, 20,000 people gathered there, etc., they all heard him because this is where he was. So now he's at the sea. He says this. This is where he was in the Sea of Tiberias. He was in this area here. And a great multitude followed him because they saw his miracles which he did on those who were diseased. Now let's stop. I said the purpose of this chapter was to prove that Jesus Christ was the bread of life. It's a great teaching on Jesus Christ being the bread of life. But it's greater than there's a sad part to this chapter. And I do believe that it is the defection of the followers. It is the trader type followers. It exposes the disciples and the followers of Jesus for what they truly are. And we understand the abandonment of him when we look at when he arose from the dead, and he goes to this area, this same area that drew in 15 to 20,000 people at this one particular event. And now he goes back to that area after he resurrected, and all that see him is 500. Percentage-wise, that's hugely small. That's a small percent. What happened to everybody else? What happened to all those who followed him and thought he was a prophet? What happened to them? And we begin to see the deterioration and the problem with humankind. We have a problem, and we studied that problem back in chapter 1. Let me review just a moment. Do you remember darkness set in, and the darkness could not comprehend the light? In other words, the darkness would look at the light being anything from God, etc., and they could not understand it. Well, here comes the light. This Jesus Christ is the light, and he comes in among people who are in darkness, and they are trying to perceive him as to who he is, and they are having a very difficult time, and we begin to see this through this passage. In chapter 5 of John, we saw how the religious leaders were willful in their disbelief. These people are just as willful. Okay, now look at the reason they're following him. First thing we come up with is the reason they're following Jesus. They're not following him because of what he's saying or who he is. He has already claimed to be God. Thousands have heard him. And now he comes here, etc., and they don't buy into that. What they're buying into is, wait a minute, he has healed a great deal of people. In other words, around the Jerusalem area, he has healed all those people that were brought to him. That would be thousands of people. And because he has healed them, they follow him because he can heal them of their physical diseases. In other words, they're following him excuse me, for what he can do for them. That's why they're following him. And Jesus went up into a mountain, and there he sat with his disciples. And the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was near. When Jesus then lifted up his eyes, he saw a great multitude come to him, and he said unto Philip, Where shall we buy bread that these may eat? And this he said to test him, for he knew what he himself would do. And we look at the people and we say, well, they're following Jesus for the wrong reasons. But what about the disciples? Here is Philip, and Jesus is going to test him. In other words, Jesus is going to expose to Philip what his problem is. And you will look what Philip's answer is. Philip answered him. He said, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may take a little. The minute Jesus turned the problem over to Philip, what was Philip's response? His immediate response was to look for mammoth, to look for money to solve the problem. And he looked at it, and he said, what? 200 denarii. It is apparent that their treasure had 200 denarii in it. And he said, this was not just sufficient to solve the problem. And we say that he just off the cuff, etc. But wait a minute. Philip was a disciple. Philip had been with Jesus all this time and had seen these miracles and literally knew that he was what he preached, what he claimed to be. He was the Son of God. And yet, here he was, the minute the problem comes up, he turns around and looks to something else to solve the problem other than Jesus himself. And you can apply it to any time today. A problem comes up, and how many people would look to money to solve their problem? Instantly, people look to money to solve their problem. And then when they don't have the money or they don't have the physical means to solve that problem, oh, we must pray. Now we must turn to God. Now we bring God in. But our first reaction is to look for money. And if you don't think that's true in this society, all you have to do is go back 1 week to when the lottery was over $1 billion and see how many people bought into that lottery, hoping that they would win and therefore their problems would be solved. Isn't that what we do? We turn to our money to solve our problems. And Philip is no different than anybody else. Here he is, a disciple, a follower, one who has seen huge miracles, etc. And where does he turn? The first time he's asked a question, he failed the test. Now look at the next disciple. One of his disciples, Andrew, look at Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said unto him, there is a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fishes. And you say, wow, it's pretty clever. He looked at what he had. Sure, he looked at what he had. Look at his response though. But, he's got this big but. But what are they among so many? In other words, here you have Andrew who looks at the huge problem of feeding this huge mass crowd, and then he looks at what he has, and he compares what he has to the problem, and he finds that what he has is insufficient. And therefore there's no hope to solving the problem. Does that sound familiar? We're just like that, right? We look at the problem, we are faced with a huge problem, etc. We look at, quote, our assets and our talents, and instantly, what do? We come to the conclusion that we can't meet this huge problem. The pragmatism that runs throughout the church is greater than theologians can handle. But that's what Andrew did. So you've got 2 disciples here who basically have exposed what they think. So instantly you draw a conclusion. You draw a conclusion that the disciples of Jesus Christ were not stuck fast in the faith. Their faith in Jesus Christ was not what it should be. Philip had faith in money. Andrew was a pessimist. He looked at the circumstances, etc., and he looked at the assets and talents he had and concluded that there's no way he's going to conquer the problem. And Jesus said to them, verse 10, make the men sit down. Now there wasn't much grass in the place, and I told you the hill was very grassy. So the men sat down, in number about 5,000. Now this word for men is males. So you've got to include everybody else. And Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, this is the feeding of the 5,000, when he had given thanks, he distributed to the disciples, and the disciples to them that were sitting there, and likewise the fishes as much as they would. So Jesus broke the bread, etc., and he gave the pieces to the 12 disciples, and then told them basically to give it to the people, etc. And as they were giving to the people, etc., it seemed they never ran out. And you will see the words here at the end of verse 11 says, as much as they would. In other words, each man took as much as he wanted. Every person took as much as they wanted. And then you come down to verse 12, it says, and when they were filled, the word for filled is the word for gluttony. In other words, when they were fully eaten, they overate, they stuffed themselves. And therefore the miracle, etc., isn't just that there was a piece of bread and a fish for each person. It was that there was as much bread and as much fish as they could possibly consume. They literally glutted themselves. That's what the word is. And so I'm sure at this point, the disciples were quite amazed as they were handing out in their little dish or little basket, etc., as they were handing out to the people. It just seemed to never run out. And then he said when they were filled, he said to the disciples, gather up the fragments that remain, that nothing be lost. And therefore they gathered them together, and they filled 12 baskets with the fragments of the 5 barley loaves, which remained over and above that which they had eaten. Now, you're now coming down to 12 baskets. You have how many disciples? 12 disciples. Each disciple gets a basket. Now, I think at this point, what Jesus is doing is he's given each disciple a basket, and he's given them something to literally, and I'm going to use this as a phrase, to chew on. In other words, think about this. This miracle wasn't just for the people, to show the people that Jesus was God, but it was for his disciples. And when this was all over, he gives them a reminder. Not something that they could say, well, you know what happened? They could look at it and say, look at this. This is a multiplication of those the small loaves and the small amount of fishes. This is a miracle that occurred. This is miracle food, or whatever you want to call it. Now that's the miracle of feeding the 5,000. Now, obviously there's a lesson to be learned here. Now, in verse 14, then those men, when they had seen the miracles that Jesus did, said, now here we go. They thought at the beginning, before the miracle occurred, they thought of him because he was healing all the diseases. Now he's fed this huge crowd to the point of being gluttonous. And now look at the reason. This is of a truth the prophet that should come into the world. In other words, they now made a statement. All right, and the statement comes out of Deuteronomy chapter 18. Let me read it to you. It says in verse 15 of Deuteronomy 18, it says this, the Lord thy God will raise up unto thee a prophet from the midst of thy brethren, like unto me. Unto him you shall hearken. And then it says this, I will raise them up a prophet from among their brethren, like unto thee, and will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak unto them all that I shall command him. And it shall come to pass that whosoever will not hearken unto my voice, which he shall speak in my name, I will require of him. But the prophet, whom you shall presume to speak a word in my name, which I have not commanded him to speak, of him shall speak in the name of other gods, even the prophet shall die. In other words, they're coming here and they're saying, this is the prophet that God promised he was raised up. Now, why is this so important for them to recognize this? To them, it said this, when Jesus therefore perceived, in verse 15, that they would come and take him by force to make him king, he departed again into a mountain himself alone. In other words, they looked at what Jesus could do. They looked at him feeding these 15,000, 20,000 people and these 5,000 males. And instantly they knew the power that this prophet had. And they realized that this man was from God. And therefore, he was what was promised. And anybody else who would speak in God's name and was false, he would be done away with. In other words, they assumed this was their liberation. This was their leader that would overcome the Romans. This was the leader that would make them great, as the scriptures had promised. As Isaiah wrote, as Ezekiel wrote, as Jeremiah wrote, that they believed him to be this prophet. But they never believed him to be God as God would be. They believed him, they looked at Jesus and they wanted to make Jesus what they wanted him to be. In other words, like people do today, They look at Jesus and they take Jesus and they make Jesus to be what they want it to be. We call it in Christendom, they put Jesus in a box. We put God in a box, and when we need him, we call him forth. In other words, we use him for whatever purpose we have. And this is what they have. So Jesus left and went into a mountain by himself because he knew what they wanted. In other words, they didn't believe him to be the Son of God and were willing to worship him. They looked at him as a tool to be used to liberate them from bondage. And when evening was now come, his disciples went down into the sea. And they entered into a boat, and they went towards Capernaum. And it was now dark, and Jesus was not come to them. And the sea arose by reason of the great wind that blew. So when they had rowed about 25 or 30 furlongs, they saw Jesus walking on the water, and drawing near unto the boat, they were afraid. Now you will notice I have a picture here. What I want you to look at is, there's Jesus walking on the water, but look at the mountains behind him. See that? Those mountains, huge mountains, are all around the Sea of Galilee. And when a storm comes up and the wind blows, it is funneled through these valleys that come down to the ocean. And literally you have a 25-mile-an-hour wind to a 30-mile-an-hour wind that when it comes, it's funneled down through those two mountains or the two hills, increases to 60, 70, 80 miles an hour to hurricane force. And that's why you have this huge storm that churns up the water. So this is frequent. This occurs very often and there in the Sea of Galilee, and it still does that today when the wind blows through those hills. And they saw Jesus. Now they were afraid. What happened? What happened to their faith? Didn't they just see Jesus multiplying the loaves of bread and the fishes? Didn't they see him feeding over 15,000 to 20,000 people miraculously? What happened to their faith? Isn't that what happened to you and I when something great happens and we give credit to the Lord for rescuing us or solving our problems, etc. And the very next time a problem arises, etc., we're right back to where we were, as if Jesus had not done anything. And that is repeated over and over again, and this is what they did. So when you look, and he said to them, he said, be not afraid, it is I, be not afraid. Then they willingly received him in the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they went. All right, we got two miracles here. What are they? One miracle is Jesus Christ is going to be used as an illustration to present Jesus Christ as the bread of life. Second miracle is not for the people. So the second miracle is for the disciples, because the disciples' faith seems to have been waning. We see that in the miracle of feeding of the 5,000. We see that with Philip and Andrew. The minute they ran into a difficulty, they didn't go to Jesus. They didn't go to God to solve their problem. They immediately went to the world. One was a pessimist, and the other one went to the money to solve their problems. And now he gives them a situation where literally he can increase their faith. He can show them who he is. And they should have recognized it when he's walking on the water. And it's obviously, I have a picture here of Peter sinking, and the story here is not, that portion of the scripture is found in the other Gospels, but John left this out here. He didn't write about Peter walking on the water, going out and sinking, because he took his eyes off of Jesus. What he's doing is he's saying, okay, Jesus Christ walked on water. About the only way I can ever walk on water is if that water is frozen and I'm on ice. I was out where Jesus, quote, they suspect Jesus was walking on the water. We stopped the boat and I contemplated, can you imagine seeing somebody walk on water without sinking? Can you imagine? It just grabbed a hold of me, and I realized, did the disciples feel the same way? Here they are in a boat, and they're in a lot of trouble, and they see Jesus walking on the water towards them, and they're afraid. They're afraid. Hey, masters here. They should have been calm as they could be. Nothing can hurt us as long as he's with us. But they were afraid. And he had to command them not to be afraid. Other portions of Scripture in the New Testament tell us not to be afraid. We don't have the spirit of fear, yet we are afraid. Because I believe when you put these two miracles together, you will see that we are very much like the disciples. We are very much like Philip, and we are very much like Andrew, a pessimist, always looking to the failings, always looking to the world to solve our problems. And Jesus is going to solve our problem as a second choice, not as a first. And this we have to keep in mind. Now we're going to take this lesson and we're going to move into Jesus' teaching on him being the bread of life, and we're going to see the correlation between the two. So until next week, I bid you Godspeed from On Victory's side. We'll see you next week.